Before I say a single word, I want you to think about the last time you drove somewhere unfamiliar. A long road. No landmarks. Just fields, trees, and the occasional farmhouse blurring past your window. You probably didn't think twice about it. Most people don't. That's the thing about the countryside. It feels safe because it feels empty. But empty is exactly what makes it dangerous. There are no witnesses. No surveillance cameras. No neighbors close enough to hear you scream. Just you, the open road, and whatever's already out there waiting. Tonight I'm sharing 3 stories with you. 3 real accounts from real people who found that out the hard way. None of them were looking for trouble. They were just passing through. That's all it takes. Stay with me. Because the 3rd story, the one I'm saving for last, is the one that still keeps me up at night. Not because of what happened, but because of what almost did. Let's begin. Story 1, the strip of road I stopped for gas in the wrong town. I need to preface this by saying that I am not someone who scares easily. I grew up rough. I've had confrontations. I know what it feels like when the hair on the back of your neck stands up. But I also know the difference between instinct and paranoia, and for most of my life I've been pretty good at telling the two apart. What happened to me on a back road in the middle of nowhere tested everything I thought I knew about that. This was about 15 years ago, maybe a little more. I was in my early 20s. I was broke, I was ambitious in the wrong direction, and I had somehow convinced myself that I was going to be a professional stand-up comedian. In hindsight, spoiler alert, I was not. But at the time, I was dead serious. I was performing at every open mic I could find, grinding through sets that bombed more often than not, and driving obscene distances just to get 5 minutes in front of an audience. And I mean obscene. I was crossing state lines for gigs that paid me nothing. I was burning gas in a car that should have been retired 2 owners before it got to me, running on bald tires and hope. My phone was one of those ancient bricks that could barely hold a signal in a city, let alone the middle of rural America. But that night, something was different. A promoter had reached out to me through a local comedian I'd been networking with. There was a competition being held 5 hours away, a proper showcase for up-and-coming comics, with actual industry judges in attendance. Moderately famous guys. People who could open doors. The cash prize was $1,000, but honestly, that wasn't even what excited me. It was the chance to stand in front of people who actually mattered and show them I had something. I left early. That was always my rule, because I also knew myself well enough to know that I got lost constantly. What I didn't do, and this is the part that still irritates me when I think about it, was double-check my MapQuest printout before I got in the car. I'd been driving through farmland and open fields for well over an hour when I realized nothing on the printout was matching what I was looking at. No landmarks. No route numbers. Just asphalt cutting through flat terrain in every direction. I kept going, figuring the road would eventually connect back to something I recognized. It didn't. Instead, it led me into a town, and I used the word town as generously as I possibly can. It was barely a strip of road. A handful of buildings, all weathered beyond what time alone could explain. There was a gas station. A few structures that might have been houses, or might have been storage units, or might have been both at once. And standing outside the gas station, grouped loosely like they'd been there for hours and had no intention of leaving, were several people. The interaction was strange immediately. Not overtly hostile, more like the air pressure changed when I stepped out of the car. These were people who'd been worn down by something. Hard living, maybe. Isolation. When I asked if they could tell me where I was, they stared at me for a beat too long before anyone answered. The one who finally spoke was short with me. Gave me just enough to confirm I'd missed a turn some miles back, that if I stayed straight on this road long enough I'd eventually hit the junction I needed. I thanked them, went to the pump, and started filling my tank. And that's when it happened. I looked up and every single one of them was staring at me. Not glancing. Not watching casually. Staring. 4 of them, standing completely still, like they'd been paused. Their eyes were flat. There was nothing behind them, no curiosity, no hostility, no warmth. Just watching. Like whatever they were doing out here didn't involve blinking or turning away. I finished filling the tank faster than I ever have in my life. Got back in the car. Drove. About 40 minutes after leaving, I was back in the trees. No buildings, no lights, just thick forest on both sides of the road and a strange feeling in my gut that I'd been driving too long without seeing anything recognizable. And then my car started shaking. Not engine trouble. A violent, lurching loss of control, the kind you feel immediately in your bones. I knew what it was before I even heard the sound. Both front tires. Gone. I pulled over, and when I crouched down and really looked, there were nails. Multiple nails in each tire, embedded deep. The kind of thing that happens when you drive over something deliberately placed in the road. I pulled out my brick phone and had almost no signal. That's when I saw the headlights behind me. Far back. Stopped. Just sitting there, aimed at my car, for 5 full minutes. And then they started moving. Slowly. Coming toward me. And at the same moment, 2 more lights appeared from ahead. Coming fast. The same beat-up white pickup truck that had blown past me on this road nearly an hour earlier. The one I hadn't thought twice about. Before I could process any of that, someone slammed a fist against my driver's side window so hard the whole car shook. It was one of the men from the gas station. He was pulling at my door handle, yanking it, throwing his weight against it. Another figure moved to the passenger side and started doing the same thing. They were making sounds but not words. Grunting. Pulling. I was yelling at them to stop, and it was like they couldn't understand me. And then the man at my window stopped. He just stood there and looked at me through the glass. The same flat eyes from the gas station. The same pause. And then, without any warning at all, he opened his mouth and screamed. Not a shout. A full, primal, howling scream at the top of his lungs. Something in me cut through the fear and went straight to action. I threw the door open as hard as I could. The impact knocked him off balance. I ran, not deep into the woods, which would have been a death sentence in the dark, but just a few feet in, and dropped flat to the ground in the undergrowth. I could hear them crashing past me, heading deeper into the trees, assuming I'd kept running. I waited. When I was sure they'd passed, I got up, ran back to my car, grabbed my backpack and phone, and ran down the road. I ran for the better part of 30 minutes before a pair of headlights came from ahead and a woman stopped for me. She was the kind of person who restores your faith in strangers. She let me sit in her passenger seat and called the police herself. The cops came. Looked at my car. Looked at the door dents. Very politely made it clear that without more concrete evidence, there was nothing they could do. Then they wrote me 2 tickets for lapsed registration and insurance. I never found out who those people were or what they wanted. I never found out if the nails were placed intentionally, though I've never believed in that particular coincidence. What I know is this: whatever they had planned for me that night, they had planned it carefully. And if I hadn't trusted my gut in that ditch, I don't think I'd be here to tell you about it. If these stories are already getting under your skin, good. That means you're paying attention. Hit subscribe and the bell right now so you don't miss what's coming next week. And stay with me, because story 2 is the one people always ask about. 3 women. An abandoned farmhouse. And 3 strangers who showed up in the middle of the night wearing the most disturbing masks you've ever heard described. Don't go anywhere. Story 2, The Abandoned Gas Station. Our second story comes from a woman I'll call Sarah, and it happened on a solo road trip she took 5 years ago when she was 26 years old. Sarah had just gone through a difficult breakup and had quit a job she'd hated for 3 years. She was at one of those crossroads moments in life where you realize you need to make major changes or risk being stuck in the same unhappy patterns forever. So she did something spontaneous and honestly a little reckless. She packed a duffel bag, got in her car, and started driving with no specific destination in mind. The plan, if you could call it that, was to just drive through rural America for a week or 2, staying in cheap motels, eating at local diners, and giving herself time and space to figure out what she wanted to do with her life. She'd been on the road for about 4 days when this incident happened, somewhere in rural Missouri on back roads that barely showed up on her GPS. Sarah had deliberately been avoiding highways and interstates, preferring the scenic routes through small towns and countryside. She wanted to see real America, the places tourists never go. It was late afternoon, and Sarah had been driving for about 3 hours without seeing much of anything, just endless farmland, the occasional house set way back from the road, scattered clusters of cows or horses. Her gas tank was getting low. She'd been watching the needle creep closer to E for the past half hour, getting more nervous with each passing mile. There were supposed to be towns along this route, according to her map, but she hadn't seen anything resembling a town, just more empty countryside. Finally, she saw a sign, gas, 5 miles. Sarah felt a wave of relief. She'd make it. 5 miles later, she saw the gas station. Immediately, something felt off about it. The station looked ancient, probably from the 1960s based on the architecture and the style of the pumps. It was one of those old full-service stations with the garage bays and the big windows. But everything looked wrong. The paint was faded and peeling. The windows were filthy, covered in grime and dust. There were no price signs on the pumps, no advertisements, no indication that this was a functioning business. The parking lot was cracked and overgrown with weeds pushing through the asphalt. There was a single, ancient pickup truck parked off to the side, covered in rust, sitting on flat tires. Sarah's first instinct was to keep driving and look for another station. But her gas gauge was now on E, and she honestly didn't know if she'd make it another mile, let alone however many miles it was to the next town. She pulled into the station and up to one of the old pumps. The pumps looked like museum pieces, the kind with the analog numbers that flip over mechanically. Sarah had never actually used a pump like this before. She wasn't even sure they still worked. She got out of her car and approached the pump, looking for some kind of instructions or payment terminal. Nothing. No card reader, no instructions, no prices displayed anywhere. Sarah looked toward the station building. Through the dirty windows, she could barely make out the interior, shelves that looked mostly empty, a counter in the back. And standing behind that counter was a figure. A man, just standing there motionless, watching her. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but she needed gas. She had no choice. She walked toward the building and pushed open the front door, which resisted with a loud creak, like it hadn't been opened in a very long time. The interior was dim and musty smelling. The shelves held a few random items, ancient cans of motor oil, some packages of food that looked decades old, dusty bottles of windshield washer fluid. Behind the counter stood an old man, probably in his 70s. He had deeply tanned, weathered skin and was wearing stained coveralls and a baseball cap so dirty she couldn't even tell what color it had originally been. He smiled at her, a wide smile that showed several missing teeth. "Help you, miss?" he asked. His voice was friendly enough, but something about the way he was looking at her made Sarah extremely uncomfortable. "I need gas," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But I'm not sure how your pumps work." "Full service here," the old man said, still smiling. "I'll pump it for you. How much you need?" Fill it up, please." "Fill it up," the old man repeated, nodding slowly. "You paying cash or card?" "Card," Sarah said. The old man's smile faltered slightly. "Card machine's been down for a while," he said. "Cash only, I'm afraid." Sarah felt her stomach drop. She had some cash on her, but not much, maybe $40. "I only have $40 cash on me," she admitted. The old man's smile returned, wider than before. $40 it is, then. That'll get you about half a tank. Enough to get you where you're going, probably. He came out from behind the counter and walked past Sarah toward the door. She noticed he had a pronounced limp, dragging his left leg slightly. Sarah followed him outside and handed him the $40. As he walked to her car and started working the pump, which apparently did still function, though it made horrible grinding noises, Sarah stood awkwardly nearby, not sure what to do with herself. "Where you headed?" the old man asked, his back to her as he pumped the gas. "Just traveling," Sarah said vaguely. She didn't want to tell this stranger she was alone and had no specific destination. "Traveling alone?" he asked, turning his head to look at her with that unsettling smile. "No," Sarah lied quickly. "My boyfriend's meeting me in Kansas City." "Kansas City," the old man repeated. "Long way from here. You got a long drive ahead of you, pretty girl traveling all alone." He said it in a way that made it clear he didn't believe her lie about the boyfriend. Sarah felt her heart rate increase. She glanced at her car, calculating how quickly she could get in and lock the doors if she needed to. The pump clicked, indicating it had dispensed $40 worth of gas. The old man replaced the nozzle and turned to face Sarah fully. "You know," he said, his tone changing slightly, becoming more familiar, more intimate, "it's not safe for a young woman to be driving these back roads alone. Lots of bad folks out here. Folks who take advantage." "I'll be fine," Sarah said, taking a step toward her car. "Thank you for the gas." "You in a hurry?" the old man asked, moving slightly to position himself between Sarah and her driver's side door. "Thought you might want to come inside, use the restroom, get yourself a cold drink." "No, thank you. I really need to get going." "Awful far to the next town," the old man said. "And it's getting late. Sun'll be down in a couple hours. These roads get real dark at night. Easy to get lost, have an accident." He was definitely between her and her car door now, and it seemed deliberate. Sarah's mind was racing. She needed to get out of this situation, but she didn't want to be rude or aggressive in case she was overreacting. Maybe he was just a lonely old man trying to make conversation. But every instinct in her body was screaming that something was very wrong. "I really appreciate your concern," Sarah said, trying to sound polite but firm, "but I need to go." She moved toward her car door, and the old man shifted his position again, still blocking her path, but in a way that could be dismissed as accidental if challenged. "Tell you what," he said, and his smile had taken on a quality that made Sarah's skin crawl. "How about I close up the station and follow you for a few miles, make sure you get to the highway safe. These roads can be confusing." "That's really not necessary," Sarah said, her voice getting tighter. "Please move so I can get in my car." For a long moment, the old man just stared at her, still smiling. The air between them felt charged with tension. Then, slowly, he stepped aside. "Suit yourself," he said. "But don't say I didn't warn you. Bad things happen to pretty girls out here on these roads at night." Sarah practically lunged for her car door, yanked it open, and threw herself inside. She locked the doors immediately and started the engine with shaking hands. The old man stood right next to her window, way too close, still smiling down at her. Sarah put the car in gear and pulled away from the pump, forcing the old man to step back. As she pulled out onto the road, she looked in her rearview mirror. The old man was standing in the middle of the parking lot, watching her drive away. He raised one hand in a slow wave. Sarah drove as fast as she dared on those winding country roads, checking her rearview mirror constantly to make sure she wasn't being followed. After about 10 minutes, she felt like she could finally breathe again. She was being paranoid. The old man was creepy, sure, but he hadn't actually done anything threatening. She was fine. That's when she noticed something that made her blood run completely cold. Her gas gauge was on E. Empty. Just like it had been when she'd pulled into that station. But she'd just put $40 of gas in the tank. She'd watched the old man pump it. She'd heard the pump running, seen the numbers on the analog counter clicking over. Sarah pulled over to the side of the road, her hands shaking violently. She got out of the car and opened the fuel door. The gas cap was still on, still sealed tight, exactly as it had been before. The old man had never opened it. He'd never actually put any gas in her tank. He'd gone through the motions of pumping gas, made the right sounds, taken her $40, but he'd never actually pumped anything into her car. Which meant he'd been delaying her. Keeping her there. For what purpose, Sarah didn't want to think about. She got back in her car, locked the doors, and just sat there for a moment trying to figure out what to do. She was on E in the middle of nowhere with no idea how far the next gas station was or if she'd even make it there. Sarah decided to take the risk. She started driving again, keeping her speed low to conserve fuel, praying she'd find a real gas station before her tank ran completely dry. About 15 minutes later, she saw lights ahead, a small town. She practically cried with relief when she saw a modern gas station with LED lights and credit card readers at the pumps. Sarah filled her tank. It took almost a full tank's worth, confirming that the old man had put absolutely nothing in, and went inside to pay. The young woman behind the counter was friendly and normal, and Sarah felt safe enough to ask a question. "Is there another gas station back that way?" Sarah asked, pointing in the direction she'd come from. "Old place, looks like it's from the 60s. The cashier's expression changed immediately. "Oh, you mean Pete's old station?" "I guess." There was an old man there. The cashier shook her head. "That place has been closed for at least 20 years. Ever since Pete's son disappeared. The old man who ran it kind of lost his mind after that. Sometimes he still goes out there and pretends it's still open, but there's no gas in those pumps anymore. They've been dry for decades." Sarah felt sick. Does he ever hurt people?" The cashier shrugged. "I've heard stories, but nothing proven. Mostly he just scares people. Police can't really do anything since he technically owns the property. We just tell people to avoid that place if they see it." Sarah thanked her and left quickly. She drove straight through the night, not stopping until she was 5 states away and back in a major city with people and lights and safety. She never took another solo road trip through rural America again. Because she knows that somewhere out there, in some forgotten corner of Missouri, that old man is still standing in that parking lot. Still waiting for the next person desperate enough for gas to pull into his station. Still smiling that horrible smile. Alright everyone, we're almost at our final story, and I need to tell you, it's the darkest and most disturbing encounter of the night. But before we get there, I have to ask, are these stories keeping your attention? Are you genuinely invested? Then please, do me a huge favor right now. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves true horror, and leave a comment telling me which story has disturbed you the most so far. Your engagement genuinely makes it possible for me to keep creating this content. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you definitely don't want to miss future videos like this. Now, let's finish with a story that will make you understand why you should never, ever trust strangers in isolated rural areas. Story 3, The Helpful Neighbors. Our final story is the most disturbing of the night, and it comes from a couple I'll call David and Emma. This happened 3 years ago during what was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway to the countryside. David and Emma had been dating for about 2 years at the time. They both worked stressful jobs in the city, David in finance, Emma in healthcare, and they were desperately in need of a break from urban life. Emma found a listing online for a small cabin rental in rural West Virginia. The photos looked perfect: charming wooden cabin, surrounded by forest, complete privacy, no neighbors for miles. The price was incredibly cheap, just $150 for an entire weekend. The owner explained in the listing that they were trying to attract more renters and were offering promotional rates. David and Emma booked it immediately. They left the city on a Friday afternoon, driving about 4 hours into increasingly rural West Virginia territory. The highways gave way to state routes, which gave way to county roads, which eventually gave way to unmarked dirt roads. Their GPS kept insisting they'd reached their destination, but they couldn't see any cabin, just dense forest on both sides of this narrow dirt road. Finally, after driving slowly for another 10 minutes, they spotted a small wooden sign mostly hidden by overgrown bushes, Whispering Pines Cabin. An even narrower dirt driveway led off the main road into the woods. David turned onto the driveway, and they drove for about a quarter mile through thick trees before the cabin finally came into view in a small clearing. It looked exactly like the photos, small but well-maintained, with a front porch, large windows, and a stone chimney. "It's perfect," Emma said happily. They parked and grabbed their bags from the trunk. The owner had told them the key would be under the welcome mat, and sure enough, there it was. Inside, the cabin was cozy and clean. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a kitchen, and a living room with a stone fireplace. Everything they needed for a quiet, relaxing weekend. David and Emma spent that first evening cooking dinner together, drinking wine, sitting by the fireplace, and just enjoying the peace and quiet. No car horns, no sirens, no city noise, just the sound of wind in the trees and the crackling fire. They went to bed early, exhausted from the drive and the work week. Around 2:30 in the morning, Emma woke up. She wasn't sure what had woken her, just a general sense that something had changed in the environment. She lay there in the dark for a moment, listening. Then she heard it, a sound from outside. Like footsteps on gravel. Emma's first thought was that it was probably just a deer or some other animal. They were in the woods, after all. Wildlife was to be expected. But the footsteps didn't sound like an animal. They sounded distinctly human, a steady, deliberate rhythm of someone walking around the cabin. Emma sat up carefully, trying not to wake David. She moved to the window and peeked through the curtain. At first, she couldn't see anything, just darkness and the vague outlines of trees. Then she saw movement. A figure was walking slowly around the perimeter of the cabin, just at the edge of the clearing where the forest began. It was too dark to make out details, but it was definitely a person. Emma's heart started pounding. She watched as the figure completed a slow circle around the cabin, then disappeared back into the trees. She stood at the window for another 10 minutes, but the figure didn't reappear. Emma eventually convinced herself it must have been a property owner or maintenance person checking on the cabin. Maybe they did nighttime security rounds or something. She went back to bed and eventually fell asleep, though it took a while. The next morning, she told David what she'd seen. "That's weird," David agreed. "But maybe it was the owner checking on the property? Let me text them." He sent a message to the phone number they'd been given. "Hi, just wanted to check. Do you or anyone else come by the cabin at night? My girlfriend saw someone walking around early this morning." The response came back within a few minutes. "No, we don't do any nighttime checks. Property is completely private. Might have been a local out for a walk on the trails nearby. Nothing to worry about." That explanation didn't quite make sense to Emma, who goes for a walk in the woods at 2:30 in the morning, but she let it go. They spent the day hiking, reading, and relaxing. It was exactly the peaceful getaway they'd needed. That night, they made dinner again and settled in for another cozy evening by the fire. Around 11 p.m., they decided to head to bed. That's when they heard a knock on the door. Both of them froze, looking at each other. "Are you expecting anyone?" Emma whispered. David shook his head. Another knock, louder this time. David stood up and walked to the door. Emma followed close behind him. "Who is it?" David called through the closed door. "Hey there," came a man's voice from outside, friendly and casual. "Sorry to bother you folks. We're your neighbors from about a mile down the road. We saw your lights were on and thought we'd come introduce ourselves. David and Emma looked at each other uncertainly. David cracked the door open slightly, keeping the chain lock engaged. Outside stood two men, both probably in their 40s. One was tall and thin with a scruffy beard. The other was shorter, stockier, wearing a camouflage hunting jacket. Both were smiling in a friendly way. "Hi," the tall man said. "I'm Derek, this is my brother Matt. We live just down the road. Wanted to welcome you to the area." "That's very nice of you," David said cautiously. "We're just here for the weekend." "Weekend getaway, here?" Matt said. "Beautiful spot for it. You folks from the city?" "Yeah, we are," David confirmed. "Well, we won't keep you," Derek said. "Just wanted to let you know we're around if you need anything. Cell service is pretty bad out here, so if you have any trouble, our place is about a mile that way," he pointed off into the woods, "and we've got a landline if you need to make calls." "That's good to know, thank you," David said, starting to close the door. "Oh, and one more thing," Derek added quickly, his foot moving slightly forward, not enough to be blocking the door, but close. "You folks planning to do any hiking tomorrow?" "We might," Emma said from behind David. "Why?" "Just be careful if you head east from here," Matt said. "There's some private property in that direction, and the owner is, well, let's just say he doesn't like trespassers. Got dogs and everything." "Thanks for the warning," David said. "No problem. You two have a good night now." The two men turned and walked away from the cabin, disappearing into the dark woods. David closed and locked the door, then looked at Emma. "That was weird, right?" he said. Emma nodded. "Who comes to someone's rental cabin at 11 p.m. to introduce themselves?" They both stood at the window and watched, but the two men didn't reappear. "Maybe it's just rural hospitality?" David suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. They went to bed, but Emma had a hard time falling asleep. Something about those two men had felt off, the way they'd asked questions, the way they'd positioned themselves at the door, the odd warning about hiking east. Around 1 a.m., Emma heard something that made her sit bolt upright in bed. Voices. Outside the cabin. She shook David awake. "Listen," she whispered. They both sat in silence, barely breathing. There were definitely voices outside, at least two people, maybe more, speaking in low tones that didn't quite carry enough to make out words. Then footsteps. Multiple sets of footsteps, walking around the cabin just like the figure from the previous night. David slowly got out of bed and moved to the window. Emma followed. They peered through the curtain. There were at least 4 figures visible now, maybe 5, all walking slowly around the perimeter of the cabin. Every so often, one of them would approach a window and appear to be looking inside, though the curtains were all closed. "What the fuck?" David breathed. One of the figures tried the front door handle, they could hear it clearly rattling. Emma grabbed David's arm, terrified. "We need to call the police," she whispered. David pulled out his phone. No service, just like the neighbors had mentioned. "Fuck," he muttered. They watched as the figures continued circling the cabin for what felt like hours but was probably about 20 minutes. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, the figures retreated back into the woods and disappeared. David and Emma sat up the rest of the night with the lights on, David holding a kitchen knife, both of them jumping at every sound. The moment the sun started rising, they threw their belongings into their bags and loaded the car. They didn't even bother cleaning up the cabin. They just left the key on the counter and got the hell out of there. As they drove down the dirt driveway toward the main road, Emma looked back at the cabin one more time. There, at the edge of the tree line, she saw them. Derek and Matt, the neighbors from the night before, along with at least 4 other people, all standing in a line, watching them drive away. Not moving. Not waving. Just watching. David drove as fast as he dared on those dirt roads until they finally reached a paved highway. Only then did they start to feel safe enough to breathe. When they got back to the city, David left a scathing review of the cabin, mentioning the people who had harassed them all night. The listing was taken down the next day. But here's the part that still haunts them. A few months later, Emma was scrolling through local news stories online and came across an article about West Virginia. A couple had gone missing in the same general area where their cabin had been. Their car was found abandoned on a dirt road, but the couple themselves were never found. The article mentioned that local authorities suspected foul play and that the area had a history of people disappearing under mysterious circumstances. Emma showed the article to David, and they both felt sick. Because they realized what had probably been happening at that cabin. The cheap rental price, the isolated location, the friendly neighbors who showed up late at night to scope them out, the people circling the cabin in the dark. They'd been bait. And if they hadn't left when they did, if they'd stayed for the full weekend like they'd planned, they might have become another missing persons case. David and Emma never went back to rural West Virginia. They rarely even talk about that weekend anymore. But Emma still has nightmares about those figures circling the cabin in the dark. And sometimes, she wonders how many other people rented that cabin who weren't lucky enough to leave when morning came. 3 stories. 3 isolated rural locations. 3 encounters with people whose intentions were anything but friendly. The witch church hidden in the South Carolina woods, where outsiders are never welcome. The abandoned gas station run by a man who traps travelers and steals their money. And the rental cabin that served as bait for something much darker. These stories remind us that isolation isn't always peaceful. Sometimes, it's dangerous. Sometimes, the people living in forgotten rural communities have their own rules, their own ways, and they don't want outsiders discovering their secrets. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you for watching. Please hit that like button right now, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Leave a comment and tell me, which story disturbed you the most? And have you ever experienced something similar in a rural area? Most importantly, remember this: if you're ever traveling through unfamiliar countryside and something feels wrong, trust that instinct. Don't be polite. Don't worry about overreacting. Just leave. Because in isolated areas, there's no one around to help you if things go wrong. Stay safe out there, everyone. And remember, not every friendly face in the countryside has friendly intentions. Until next time.